Episodes of the Green Corn Rebellion Show are sponsored by Oklahoma Progress Now. Oklahoma Progress Now is a 501c4 organization focused on building progressive power in Oklahoma. Their primary efforts are on developing progressive content for a 21st century audience, coalition, and capacity building across progressive organizations and causes, and working to see elected leaders who are more responsive to their constituents and the needs of the many. Areas of focus include progressive messaging and communications, coalition building and resource sharing, and focused progressive policy goals. You can check out their Twitch live streams, and they go live on Facebook on at noon, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Please support this organization. It's a really great organization. It's just getting started here in Oklahoma. Thank you. Now enjoy the rest of the video. Hello, this is the Green Corn Rebellion Show. I'm Gregory Hardin II, and today I am here with Matthew Green, who is the MP for Hamilton Centre in the Canadian House of Commons. How are you doing today?
Oh man, this is great. I'm super excited to join you. I love the ability for us to connect across borders and, have these really critical discussions about the point in time that we're having right now.
Yeah. So, first question I have here is where are you from and where'd you grow up?
Born and raised right here in Hamilton Center. My father was a steel worker turned teacher. My mother worked for the federal government. And Hamilton, in a lot of ways, is kind of like a Buffalo or a Pittsburgh. It's a steel city. We have a very blue collar, long history with organized labor. Um, and a lot of concentration of social pressures, but also a lot of resilience and coalition building and mutual aid, mutual care. It's a beautiful city.
That's great. So, what all have you done prior to going into politics?
Well, I mean, I like many young people in the '90s, I left this city never thinking that I would return. It was pretty bleak. There wasn't really a prospect for jobs, and I went and played like varsity football on the East Coast, and then went over to Germany for a little while. But when I came back, I saw opportunities here and it felt like home, like no matter where you go, there you are. So as far as I went away from Hamilton, I found myself back here like many Hamiltonians do in their hometown and started a small business, mostly because I was unemployable. Like I just didn't really feel like I fit in
Mm-hmm.
or I wouldn't really I'd get looked over for jobs, and I remember working for a bank part-time when I came back from university. I was like a teller. And there was a financial advisor who got on my till to do a really weird transaction and put my till off. And I was out, which means they like demanded that I was supposed to stay overtime without getting paid. But the kicker was is that a friend of mine had passed away, and I had already told them that I had to go and leave to Montreal that night to be there for a funeral, and they just didn't care. You know what I mean? Like they just really didn't care. So not only were they expecting me to fix somebody else's problems, they weren't paying me overtime, but when it came down to actual like grieving somebody who was my roommate very close to me, they really didn't care. And I realized in that moment that you know, um, working for somebody else at somebody else's whim in that way just wasn't going to cut it. So I had to work for myself. So I started small business. I drew on what I knew, which was fitness and conditioning, coming from football, and applied that to community training, team training, individual strength and conditioning, and did that for close to 10 years. Worked with some professional lacrosse teams, worked with the Rochester Nighthawks out of the NLL in Rochester, and yeah, man, just really kind of came to my politics honestly by just watching the challenges in my community and not seeing the kind of response from government that I would expect and hope for.
Okay. So what made you want to get into politics starting as a city councilor in Hamilton?
I didn't really feel like my politics were reflected in the partisan parties that we have here. I didn't see my people reflected there, and I didn't see my values necessarily shared. And so I knew that by being a city councillor, you're essentially nonpartisan in Canada as city councillors. In Ontario, I should say, as a caveat. There's party systems municipally in other places, but not in Ontario. I really wanted to respond to the immediate needs of my neighbors, my community, because previously there had been somebody elected who didn't really live here and I don't think was necessarily serving the interests of the residents of our ward. So I ran to take on a longtime incumbent. And as fate would have it, he ended up passing away. And then I ended up running against 13 other people in a Wild West election and won that. And I spent 4 years, really honestly trying to respond to the symptoms of like decades of austerity, tax cuts and cuts to services, privatization of services, the outsourcing of public sector services, the erosion of our manufacturing sector. And I realized that I was just treating the symptoms of bad systems, that I could wake up and take 100 calls a day and not be able to fundamentally change why I was taking those calls. You know what I mean?
All right. Um, so explain your politics to me. I know you're a member of NDP, which is a social democratic party that has democratic socialists in it. Would you consider yourself to be a socialist or a social democrat? And also, can you explain a little bit of how you came to that conclusion as to what you being a part of NDP and whatnot?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I started off owning a small business. I was an entrepreneur from this this mythology of like philanthropical entrepreneurialism or social capitalists. As a young person who was really I think fooled by the liberal ideal of the hyper individual responsibility. And I came to my politics honestly by watching in real time the suffering of my community and recognizing that these systems were failing our people in our communities. And then when I became like involved in the philanthropic world, I was on a board for a major community foundation. And we started to get granular on what poverty looked like in our city, the disparities of wealth between my neighborhood, which would have a 61-year life expectancy, 61 years versus some communities that were only 10 minutes away who had like 81-year life expectancies. The social determinants of health were uh, kind of exposed in a way that showed just the profound inequality and the profound suffering that our children would face, our seniors, people living with disabilities, racialized communities, and then when I became a counselor, look, man, like I went into city council as a social democrat, right? Like somebody who had evolved their politics to a place of understanding that capitalism was failing. But I was a social democrat in a place of like, you know, kind of a reformist ideology that we can do some things. Uh, However, my experience as a counselor, taking 100 calls a day, many of which were imminent crisis for people facing imminent eviction, unscrupulous landlords, gentrification, deep poverty, mental health, uh, a complete abandonment of entire communities and neighborhoods. I became radicalized. When you get a call from somebody who's facing imminent homelessness, and you know that our systems simultaneously were having condos being built at record numbers, cranes dotting the sky, building permits of $1 billion a year, while simultaneously you have people living in tents. You know the system is rigged, and you see it. You see the suffering, and if you see it and you're not angry, that's a whole other conversation. So in my time as a counselor, I went from like a social democrat to a democratic socialist, recognizing that while I'm certainly not authoritarian in any way, nor would I ever want to live in an authoritarian place, state planning on the base necessities of life are an essential component for a just and economic and a democratic economy.
All right. I like that answer. So how do you feel about the future of the NDP as a party?
So for your listeners in the States, we're a two-party system with five parties. So we are unlike, we would be the equivalent of the Justice Dems having their own party, or the Workers' Party having their own party, or um, so we're founded on a democratic socialism and organized labor, the CCF in the Canadian Labor Congress. So those are our roots. And then when you saw the kind of Bill Clinton um, 90s kind of liberalism in the Democratic Party, the James Carville kind of like focus
Hmm.
group, professionalization of organizing, polling, trying to find the right phrase in a very aesthetic way, like a faux aggressivism. That reached over to Canada too. People are trying to chase this way of winning against the right. However, we have a corporate Dem party in Canada. That's the Liberal Party of Canada. It's a corporatist kind of faux aggressive party that is all about identity politics without the class analysis. So our party is, I think, reclaiming leftist space, particularly with this crop, this cohort of MPs, members of parliament. We're definitely unabashed. And I think that, one of the ways in which you're seeing the AOCs and the squad emerge is because with social media, you no longer need the central party to do your comms. There's no comms director who's doing a press release to get us in a mainstream media story. We are basically taking our narratives back and having uh, sovereign is probably a big word, but having more independence in how we engage with the public and how the public engages with us. Hence this podcast, bro. Like,
Hmm.
this doesn't happen 5 years ago.
Yeah. All right. So, how do you feel about how Canada has handled the pandemic? And also, could you please explain how Canada handled the pandemic?
So we're in a minority government, which again, a two-party system with five parties. Uh, we ended up being in a minority government, meaning that it's not quite a coalition, but the governing minority needs to have support of one of the other four parties in order to pass bills. And so we pushed this government to provide deeper social safety nets for people. We pushed for $2,000 universal income for people during COVID. The Liberal Party, which was like obsessed with means testing, much in the way the Democratic Party is, filtering people out who need it the most so they can make big announcements and never have to deliver on it. We pushed them to eventually go from $900 a month to $2,000 a month. We pushed for wage subsidies. We pushed for support for seniors and people living with disabilities. But they fought us tooth and nail every step along the way. So they like to speak the language of progress without committing to the actions of justice, which again is that kind of James Carville, Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
Barack Obama in a lot of ways, politics, right? It's the language of hope and the aspiration of hope without the commitment to real and lasting systemic justice.
All right. But yeah, because the reason why I asked is because you guys ended up handling the pandemic a lot better than how we did here in America. And a lot of that was because of the pressure that NDP was able to put on the Liberal Party and Justin
It is,
Trudeau.
but I
Yeah.
need to be clear about something. Like we have a maple wash version of our country that Americans love to buy into because it looks good, it sounds good, it feels good,
Hmm.
and you have the lowest common denominator, like you not even denominator, the lowest bar of standard when you have a fascist like Donald Trump in government. And so, relatively speaking, it feels good. However, if our population was the equivalent, we would have had 103,000 deaths. We have had decades of austerity and privatization of our healthcare. We like to say we have universal healthcare. In fact, that is not true. We don't have universal pharmacare. We don't have dental care. We don't have universal mental health supports. eye care. That's left out. And we privatized our long-term care facilities, which is where 80% of the deaths happened in the privatized long-term care, where our seniors were sacrificed at the whim of right-wing populist movements towards quote unquote opening up the economy.
Right. Last question I have here is what kind of music do you listen to?
Mm, super eclectic. Anything that speaks to my emotion. I have been on some Tracy Chapman these days. Like the sisters just speaking to me. I've been digging a lot of folk, you know. I'm like an old school hip hop head. Like I'm 40, so the new trap stuff doesn't really cut it, but I'll still tune in and appreciate the lyricism of some of the underground artists. But yeah, there's some good stuff coming out of Canada. I've been going back to like old school. Like, I don't know. Again, it's the darkness you're trying to find light, like old school Negro spirituals, union songs, leftist, like anarchist songs, fight songs, things that just root me in resistance to what is impending. And yeah, I think I've kind of definitely evolved my taste in music over the years. But right now, man, talking about a revolution, I can have that on repeat, repeat. What else you, man? I see you got the Lincoln Park. What's your
Yeah,
go-to?
I mean, most of my favorite bands are like Linkin Park, Limp Bizkit, Korn,
No doubt.
Chevelle. Yeah,
Have you heard of the Arkells?
The Who.
Yeah, exactly. It's a band from Canada. They're called the Arkells.
Hmm.
I got to pick them up because they're from Hamilton, and their politics are tight. Like they really support great initiatives and campaigns. And if you get a chance, check out the Arkells. You know who else I've been on, man? Like when things got real dark, was that Kedron Bryan, I Just Want to Live. You know that young brother who sang that gospel, that spiritual, I Just Want to Live. I've been on that too. You know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
I ruminate on music. I just listen to the same tracks over and over and over again until it's played out. Leon Bridges, you know,
Do you
South
like
African.
Nickelback? Do you like Nickelback?
Nah, man, I don't really fuck with Nickelback. No, no, no.
What about 3 Days Grace?
You're going old school. That's like my vintage. You know what I mean? Like not so much because for me, music is rooted in a time and a place. And
Hmm.
in those times, in those places, I wasn't really down with that. I was a Pearl Jam guy. You know what I
Okay.
mean? Like I could do Foo Fighters. I like that. But in a more contemporary way, Black Pumas. I've been on some Black Pumas. Did you get your rap? Your Spotify rap?
Um, Spotify Wrapped. I mean, I don't use Spotify. I use Apple
Oh,
Music. Yeah.
Spotify basically just shows you all the stuff that you've been playing back to you.
Yeah.
So for me, there's a great band called St. Paul and the Broken Bone,
Hmm.
really solid. Black Pumas. Yeah, man, like just trying to get that soundtrack to life.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Where can we find you on social media and whatnot?
You can find me at Matthew Green, MatthewGreen, NDP, and on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. I do a lot of live streams too. I do a series called Parle to the People, where I bring on guests just like you're doing right now, but they're video based. Streams to Twitch, it streams to Twitter, Facebook, and Twitch simultaneously. And I do a series called Walk to Work,
Hmm.
where as I walk over to my office, I just bring people on Instagram. Anybody who wants to talk at any time. It's like an open door, digital town hall format that I really enjoy. So yeah, man, I like engaging in all these ways.
All right, cool.